The letter arrived on a Tuesday. By Friday, everything Rowan had believed about her future was ash. She had crossed 3 states with a toddler on her hip and $42 in her coat pocket, chasing a promise written in careful cursive on pale blue paper. I will meet you at the station. We will build a life together. But when the train finally groaned to a stop at Ash Hollow, Montana, and the steam cleared from the platform, there was no man waiting. There was only a folded note pinned to the station door, addressed to no one in particular, left like an afterthought. I changed my mind. Don't look for me. No name, no apology, nothing. If you have ever been left somewhere you didn't choose to be, with someone depending entirely on you, you already know what that moment feels like. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it, because what happens next to this woman is something you will not see coming. The conductor didn't look at her twice. That was the thing Rowan would remember later. Not the cold, not the note, not even the hollow sound her boots made on the empty platform. She would remember that the conductor walked right past her and little Eli without slowing his step, the way a man walks past a piece of furniture he's already decided doesn't belong to him. She was carrying the boy on her left hip, her travel bag slung over the opposite shoulder, and she had been awake for going on 31 hours. Her back ached in a way that had stopped feeling like pain and started feeling like weather, just something she lived inside now. Eli pressed his face against her neck. He smelled like the crackers she'd been feeding him since Kansas City, and his small hands were fisted in the collar of her coat like he already understood, at 3 years old, that holding on was the safest thing a person could do. She read the note a second time, then a third. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Some hidden meaning, maybe. Some explanation that would make sense of the fact that a man named Douglas Fenn had exchanged 7 letters with her over 4 months, had described his house and his land and his eagerness for a family, had written the words, "You sound like exactly the kind of woman I've been praying to find," and had then apparently decided that meeting her at a train station in November was too much trouble. She folded the note and put it in her coat pocket. She didn't cry. She had learned, somewhere in the years since Eli's father had made his own exit, that crying before you absolutely had to was a waste of resources. And she was already very low on resources. The station itself was barely a room, 1 wall of ticket windows, a potbelly stove that had gone cold, 2 benches, and a clock on the wall that hadn't been wound recently enough to be trusted. Through the glass door she could see the main street of Ash Hollow stretching out in the gray afternoon light. A general store, a feed supply, a church with peeling paint on the front steps, a saloon that seemed to be the only building with warm light spilling from its windows. Population, she guessed, of maybe 300 people, maybe less. She had come here for a man who was gone. She had no return ticket. She had no letter of introduction to anyone in this town, no family within 1,000 miles, and $42 that had started as $68 before the train fare, the crackers, and the small bottle of children's cough syrup she'd bought in Billings when Eli started sounding rattly in his chest. She picked up her bag. She pushed open the station door. The cold hit her like a wall. Not just cold. Montana cold. The kind that has intention behind it, that moves into your lungs and takes up residence there. She pulled Eli tighter and started walking. The woman at the general store heard her out with the expression of someone performing patience rather than actually feeling it. Her name was Mrs. Pruitt. It was stitched on the apron, and she had the particular kind of tightness around the mouth that Rowan had learned to recognize as a woman who had already made up her mind before you finished your sentence. Rowan explained as plainly as she could that she had come to Ash Hollow expecting to be met, that she had not been, and that she was looking for temporary lodging. She had money. She could pay. She just needed somewhere to sleep tonight, maybe a few nights while she figured out her next step. Mrs. Pruitt looked at Eli. Then she looked at Rowan's left hand. No ring. "We don't have a boarding house," Mrs. Pruitt said. "There's the hotel at the end of 2nd Street, but Mr. Calloway doesn't take—" She paused, choosing the word with care. "Unaccompanied women." Rowan kept her face still. "Is there anyone who rents rooms, privately?" "Not that I know of." Anyone who might need help in exchange for shelter? Cook, clean, bookkeeping? Mrs. Pruitt began straightening a row of canned goods that didn't need straightening. I really couldn't say. Eli sneezed. Mrs. Pruitt took a small step backward, as if illness were a character flaw. Rowan thanked her. She left. She tried 4 more places in the next hour. The hotel, where Mr. Calloway, a man with the posture of someone who had been personally wronged by the concept of generosity, told her through the barely open door that he had no vacancies, which she could see was a lie because there were no horses at the hitching post and the dining room lights were all dark. The schoolteacher's house, where a woman named Miss Hale was actually kind enough to look sorry, but explained that the school board had rules about who could stay in the schoolhouse residence. The minister's house. The minister was away. The saloon. The man behind the bar looked at Eli and told her the rooms upstairs weren't suitable for children. That last one she actually believed. She was back on the main street by 4 in the afternoon, and the light was going fast. In November in the mountains, dark comes early and comes hard. The temperature had already dropped 10 degrees from when she'd stepped off the train, and the wind had picked up enough to sting her cheeks. Eli had been quiet for a long time. Too quiet. The way small children get when they're past hungry and past tired and into something deeper. A kind of bewildered exhaustion, like the world has stopped making sense, and they're waiting for someone to explain it. I know, Rowan murmured against his hair. I know, baby. She went back to the station. There was nowhere else to go. She sat on the bench nearest the cold stove and tried to think. She went through her options the way she always did when she was scared, methodically, out loud in her head, one thing at a time. She could send a telegram to her cousin Margaret in Spokane. Margaret had 3 kids of her own and a husband who barely tolerated her, but she was blood and she might wire money. That would take days she wasn't sure she had. She could try to find Douglas Fenn, but she didn't know where he lived, didn't know anyone who might know him, and showing up looking for a man who had explicitly left her a note saying to stop looking felt like a humiliation she wasn't ready to perform in front of strangers. She could try to sell something. She had a small brooch that had been her mother's. Silver, nothing fancy. And her extra pair of boots, maybe $10, $12 if she found the right buyer. That was another few days. Maybe a week if she ate almost nothing. And then what? She didn't have an answer to that. Eli had fallen asleep against her shoulder. She could feel his small rib cage rising and falling, and she kept her breathing slow and careful so as not to wake him. Outside the station windows, the light finished dying. The street went dark except for the saloon glow and one lamp burning in the general store, while Mrs. Pruitt closed up for the night. Rowan watched her through the glass, moving around inside the store, and felt something she rarely let herself feel anymore. A hot, furious kind of grief. The kind that doesn't have an object, that has nowhere to go. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had been careful, deliberate, had asked every sensible question in every letter. She had made the best choice she could see. And here she was anyway, sitting on a bench in a train station in a town that didn't want her, holding a sleeping child who had no idea how precarious the next 24 hours actually were. The station agent came out from the back room at 5:30 and told her, without quite meeting her eyes, that the station closed at 6 and she'd need to move along. Where? She asked. She didn't say it sharply. She said it the way a person asks a question they genuinely need answered. He didn't have an answer either. But she was standing on the platform with Eli awake now and fussy, doing that half cry that means a child is too tired to commit to full crying when she heard the wagon. She almost didn't register it at first. There had been wagons all afternoon, but this one slowed and stopped, and the man holding the reins didn't move along the way everyone else had. He was not a remarkable-looking man. That was the first thing she noticed. Or rather, that was the first thing she noticed not. She had half expected, in some tired, foolish part of her brain, that the moment help finally arrived it would look a certain way. Tall and certain. Something out of one of those stories. He was maybe 40, with a working man's hands, and a coat that had been mended at the left elbow. He had the look of someone who had spent a great deal of time outdoors, not because he liked poetry about it, but because there was work to do out there. His face was tired in the same specific way that hers probably was. Not the tiredness of one bad night, but the tiredness of many hard years stacked on top of each other. He looked at Eli first, then at her. "Train station closes at 6, he said. "I know." She was past the point of offering explanations to strangers. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone thinking of what to say, more the quiet of someone who had already made a decision and was deciding how to say it without making her feel small. "I've got a room that's empty," he said. "My ranch is 8 miles out. I'm not offering more than that. A room, meals, and honest work if you want it. My housekeeper left last month and I haven't replaced her." Rowan looked at him. She was very good at reading men by now, not because she had any particular gift for it, but because her life had required her to develop the skill the way a person living near water develops the skill of reading weather. She read him for the usual things, the angle of eye contact, what his hands were doing, whether his offer felt like a transaction with hidden costs. His hands were on the reins, and they were still. He wasn't looking at her the way men looked at women they were calculating something about. He was looking at her the way a person looks at a problem they intend to solve without being thanked for it. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he said. "My name is Silas Boone. Ask anyone in town." He paused. "Though I'd suggest Mrs. Alderman at the church office rather than Pruitt at the general store." Despite everything, something almost broke into a smile in her chest. Not her face was too tired, but somewhere. "Why are you offering?" she asked. He glanced at Eli. "The boy shouldn't spend another night in this cold," he said. And that was all. No performance around it, no looking away dramatically, just the plain fact of it, spoken by someone who had decided facts were sufficient. Rowan had every reason to say no. She had learned the hard way about plain-spoken men who turned complicated the moment you depended on them. She knew what it meant to climb into a situation that looked simple from the outside. She was 28 years old and had a child who needed her to stay alive and functional, and the risk calculation on getting into a wagon with a stranger in the dark was not favorable. She looked at the station door. The lamp inside was already off. She looked at Eli, who had stopped fussing and was now staring at the horse with the total attention that small children bring to animals they haven't met yet. She picked up her bag. "I'll want to speak to whoever you mentioned," she said. "Mrs. Alderman, before anything is settled." "Fair enough," Silas said. "She'll be home tonight if you want to stop on the way through town." He didn't reach for her bag. He didn't offer his hand. He just waited while she settled Eli on her lap and then clicked the horse forward, and they moved out into the dark main street of Ash Hollow, and she held her son and watched the town pass and didn't allow herself to think about whether she'd made the right call, because thinking about that right now was a luxury she simply could not afford. Mrs. Alderman turned out to be a round, sharp-eyed woman of about 60 who answered her door in her house coat without embarrassment and listened to Rowan's brief, controlled summary of the situation with an expression that managed to be sympathetic and unsentimental at the same time. "Silas Boone is the most decent man in this county," she said, "which I say knowing that the bar in this county is not always high. His wife died 3 years ago. He's been running that ranch short-handed ever since." She looked at Eli, who had discovered her door cat and was attempting to form a friendship with it. "He's not the kind of man who makes offers he doesn't mean." "What kind of man is he?" Rowan asked. Mrs. Alderman considered. Quiet, stubborn, not great at asking for help, but fair. She looked at Rowan with the directness of a woman who had outlived enough nonsense to be done with indirection. "Are you good at hard work?" "Yes." "Do you have a temper?" Rowan thought about the last 6 hours. "I have a temper. I'm good at not using it." Something shifted in the older woman's face. "That's an honest answer." She reached inside her door and produced a small card with her name and address on it. She pressed it into Rowan's hand. "If anything is wrong at that ranch, anything at all, you come here, day or night. You understand me?" Rowan closed her fingers around the card. "Yes, ma'am," she said. The road to Boone Ranch was dark and cold and long, and Eli fell asleep again almost immediately, heavy against Rowan's side. Silas drove without talking much, which she appreciated. He pointed out a landmark once, a distinctive rock formation he said helped people find the turnoff in a snowstorm, and she filed it away in the same mental cabinet where she stored all information that might someday matter in an emergency. She had a lot of information in that cabinet. When the ranch came into view, it was larger than she'd expected. Not grand, but solid. A main house, a barn, a smaller outbuilding, fencing that was maintained if not beautiful. A working property. Someone's life's work, You could tell that just from the way everything was arranged. Two ranch hands were still in the barn doing evening chores. They looked at her and Eli with undisguised curiosity and said nothing, which she suspected was their version of good manners. Silas showed her to a room at the back of the house, clean, small, with a quilt on the bed and a window that faced the eastern mountains. He showed her where the extra blankets were and said breakfast was at 5:30 if she was up for it, and later if she needed sleep. He was on his way out the door when she said, "Mr. Boone." He stopped. "Thank you," she said. She meant it without performance. He nodded once. "You can call me Silas. Mr. Boone was my father, and he wasn't particularly pleasant." And then he pulled the door shut, and Rowan sat on the edge of the bed with her sleeping son, in a warm room in a stranger's house, with the card of a woman named Mrs. Alderman in her coat pocket, and $42 she hadn't had to spend tonight. She let herself breathe, just for a moment, just long enough to take inventory. She was upright, she was warm, Eli was breathing easy, and the next morning was still navigable. She didn't know anything about this man, or this ranch, or what the week ahead would bring. She didn't know that there was a man in Ash Hollow named Victor Harrow who already had plans for this land. She didn't know that her arrival, one tired woman and a 3-year-old on the edge of a Montana winter, was about to set something in motion that would change the future of the entire valley. She knew only that she had made it through tonight, and that tomorrow she was going to get up at 5:30 and find out exactly what kind of work was available. Because she was not going to be anyone's charity case, not for one day longer than she had to be. She lay down next to Eli without changing her clothes. She was asleep in under 3 minutes. She was up before 5:30. Not because the house woke her. The house was still dark and quiet. The kind of quiet that belongs to places where the land around them absorbs sound rather than bouncing it back. She woke because she hadn't slept past 5 in 3 years. Because Eli had been an early riser from the day he figured out mornings existed, and because some part of her brain had been running calculations all night, even while the rest of her slept. She dressed in the dark. Eli was still breathing deep and slow against the pillow, his small fist curled under his chin, and she tucked the quilt more carefully around him and left the door cracked the way she always did so she'd hear him if he woke. The kitchen was empty, but the stove was already lit, which told her either Silas was an early riser too, or the ranch hand started before dawn. There was a coffee pot, a bag of grounds, a stack of cast iron pans hung on the wall in descending size, and enough dry goods in the pantry to feed 8 people for 2 weeks without a resupply run. She took stock of all of it without touching anything yet, moving around the kitchen the way she did in any new space, memorizing where things lived, building the map she'd need later. She found the coffee and started a pot. She found a basket of eggs and the bread from yesterday's baking, still decent, and started slicing. By the time Silas came down the back stairs at 5:20, there was coffee poured and toast on the iron griddle, and she had found enough leftover salt pork in the cold box to make it a proper breakfast rather than a gesture at one. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She didn't turn around from the stove. "Black or with something in it?" A pause. "Black," he said. She poured and set the cup on his table and went back to the griddle. He sat down. She heard him wrap both hands around the cup, the small sound of the ceramic on the table, and then nothing. He wasn't one of those men who filled silence with noise. She had already guessed that from the wagon ride, but it was good to have it confirmed. "I want to talk about the arrangement," she said, "before the day starts, while it's just us." "All right." She pulled the toast off the griddle and put it on a plate and carried it to the table and sat down across from him, which she could tell mildly surprised him. She wasn't sitting across the room to deliver food. She was sitting across the table to have a conversation as an equal, and they both understood what that meant. "I don't know what you were expecting when you stopped at that station," she said, "and I'm not going to pretend I wasn't desperate, because I was. But I'm not looking for charity, and I'm not looking for," she chose the word deliberately, "complication. I need work and I need shelter while I figure out what my next step is. I can cook, keep accounts, manage a pantry, basic nursing. I can learn anything else you need that a body can learn in a reasonable amount of time." Silas listened to all of this without interrupting, which she appreciated. "What I want in exchange," she continued, "is a fair wage. Not a favor, a wage. Documented if possible. And I want it clear what my position here is, so there's no confusion for anyone. Inside this house or out." He was quiet for a moment. Then, My last housekeeper was paid $18 a month and board. That sounds right, Rowan said. I can do the same. Then we should write it down. He looked at her, not annoyed, more like he was recalibrating something. You want a written agreement? I think it's better for both of us, she said. You've got a ranch with a reputation. I'm a woman who arrived alone on a train yesterday with a child and no references anyone here can verify. A written agreement protects you as much as it protects me. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile but was related to one. I've got paper in the office, he said. The two ranch hands were named Pete and Calhoun. Pete was 23 and from somewhere in Wyoming and had the uncomplicated decency of a person who hasn't yet been hardened by enough bad luck. Calhoun was maybe 50, with a gray beard and the slow, precise movements of a man who had learned that doing things right the first time saved you more time than doing them fast. He had been with the Boone Ranch since before Silas's wife died, which Rowan filed away as significant without knowing exactly why yet. They were polite to her at breakfast in the way that men are polite when they're deciding what to make of someone. Pete talked too much, overcorrecting for his own nerves, asking Eli questions the boy was too young and too shy to answer. Calhoun said almost nothing, which was more comfortable somehow. After breakfast, Silas took her through the ranch, not a tour, more like a briefing. He had the manner of someone who disliked wasting words. The main house had 4 rooms upstairs and 2 down. The books were kept in the office off the main hall and were currently, he said without obvious embarrassment, not what they should be. The last round of accounts had been done in August. It was now late November. She could see him watching her react to that. She didn't react. I'll look at them today, she said. The barn held 11 horses. The south pasture ran to the tree line and carried the winter cattle herd. The water, he paused here, just slightly, in the way a person pauses around a subject that carries more weight than it appears to. The water came from a creek that ran through the lower valley. Spring-fed. Reliable. He said this without saying why it mattered that he said it, but she noted the pause and the choice to mention it. She noted a lot of things.
Augie.
Eli spent his first morning at Boone Ranch following Pete around the barn with the absolute focus of a child who has discovered something better than anything else that has ever existed. Pete, to his credit, handled this with genuine warmth rather than tolerance. He let the boy hand him things, narrated what he was doing, introduced each horse by name. By mid-morning, Eli was saying Biscuit very seriously every time Pete's bay mare walked past, which was the horse's actual name. And this produced in Rowan a feeling so sharp and specific that she had to look away from it before it turned into something she couldn't control. She was in the office. The accounts were, as Silas had suggested, not what they should be. Not catastrophic. She'd seen catastrophic, had inherited her own mother's finances after the funeral, and understood what genuine disaster looked like in a ledger. This was more like prolonged inattention. Things recorded in the wrong column, some months not recorded at all, invoices that had been paid but not logged. A patient person with a clear head could sort it out in a week. She started making notes on a separate sheet of paper, not changing anything yet, just mapping where the problems were. She had been at it for about 2 hours when she heard boots in the hall, and then Calhoun appeared in the doorway. He stood there a moment. She kept her eyes on the ledger but was aware of him. "You actually know what you're looking at," he said. Not a question. "My father ran a hardware business," she said. "I kept his books from the time I was 14. Another pause. Calhoun had pauses the way other men had sentences. "Previous woman Silas hired for the house," he said. "Lasted 3 weeks. One before that didn't make it past 10 days. He said this without evident malice, just the flat delivery of someone presenting relevant data. "Neither one of them came in here." She looked up at him. "Is that a warning?" "More of an observation," he said, and then he left, his boot steps retreating down the hall. She looked back at the ledger. She was going to be here longer than 10 days. The first trouble came on the 4th day, and it didn't come quietly. She was in the yard, hanging washing, when the rider came up the main road faster than someone on legitimate business needed to come up a private road. He was well-dressed in a deliberate sort of way. Coat too fine for ranch work, horse too expensive for just getting somewhere. He pulled up short in the yard and looked down at her with the particular expression of a man who has arranged his face to communicate that he is more important than whoever he is talking to. "I'm looking for Boone," he said. Not "Is Mr. Boone available?" or "Good morning." Just the name, dropped like something that didn't require manners around it. "He's in the South Field," Rowan said. She didn't drop what she was doing. "I can tell him you called when he's back." The man looked at her for a moment, then at the house, then back at her, in a way that was meant to be read as a reassessment, but was actually closer to an inventory. "You must be the woman from the train," he said. She wrung out a shirt. "Who's asking?" "Victor Harrow." He said it as though the name were supposed to do something to her. She had heard the name once from Calhoun, in passing. Something about a dispute over fencing on the lower pasture, dropped without detail, the kind of thing ranch hands mention and then leave alone when they realize you're still too new to have the context. "I'll let Silas know you stopped by, Mr. Harrow," she said. "I'd rather wait." "That's up to you," she said, "though it might be a while. He left before 7. Harrow looked at the house again. Something deliberate was happening in his expression, a calculation he wasn't bothering to hide. "Tell me," he said, casual the way things are casual when they're not. "How exactly did you come to be at Boone Ranch, Miss Mercer?" she said. "And that's between me and Silas." The smile he produced was the kind that comes before something unpleasant. "See, I ask because there are people in town, good, decent people, Mrs. Mercer, who are wondering the same thing. A single woman, no husband, a child." A pause calculated to land, and, showing up out of nowhere, Rowan folded the shirt. She set it in the basket. She picked up the basket and turned and looked at him directly. "I expect there are people in every town who wonder about things that aren't their business," she said. "Ash Hollow doesn't seem exceptional in that regard." Something shifted in Harrow's face. The pleasantness went, or the performance of it did, and what was under it was harder and flatter. "You're new here," he said. "I'll forgive you for not understanding how things work." "You're welcome to explain it to me another time," she said, "but I've got work to finish." She walked back into the house without hurrying. Inside the kitchen, with the door between her and the yard, she set the basket down and stood very still for a moment and let her heartbeat do what it needed to do. She wasn't frightened, not exactly, but she recognized what she had just been looking at. Not a man who wanted information about her, but a man who already had a use for her and was deciding whether she knew it yet. She told Silas that evening, after supper, after Eli was down. She told it the same way she'd told him she wanted a written agreement, directly, without emotional scaffolding around it, just what happened and what she thought it meant. Silas listened with his hands flat on the table. "He's been after the Lower Creek water for 2 years, he said when she finished. "What does that have to do with me?" He was quiet for a moment. "On its own, nothing. But Harrow's the kind of man who uses whatever is available. If there's a question about who is and isn't on this property legitimately—" He stopped. "He could use that," she said. "He could try." She thought about the way Harrow had looked at the house. "He'd argue I have no legal standing here, that my presence is irregular, maybe try to use it to challenge the property arrangement somehow." Silas looked at her steadily. "That's more or less what I was thinking." "Then we make sure my standing isn't irregular," she said. "We make the agreement we wrote more formal, witnessed, filed if there's a county record for employment contracts. There's a justice of the peace in Ash Hollow." "Good," she said. "We go this week." He didn't argue with her. She'd noticed that about him. He didn't argue with logic just because it came from a direction he wasn't used to. It was one of the things that made her trust him, or begin to, in the careful, incremental way she trusted anything now. "Rowan," he said, and stopped. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She registered it without indicating that she had. "What Harrow said in the yard," he continued, "about people in town wondering. I want you to know, that's his doing, not something that was already there." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "Men like that don't invent the fire. They just decide where to point it." Something shifted in his face. Not the almost smile from that first morning. Something more serious than that. Something that looked like recognition. "That's exactly right," he said quietly. "Wham." The following Tuesday, she and Silas drove into Ash Hollow together, which was its own kind of statement, whether either of them intended it that way. Eli sat between them on the wagon seat wearing the wool hat she'd bought from Mrs. Pruitt's general store, who had, in the shift between Rowan's first visit and now, become measurably warmer, something Rowan suspected had more to do with Silas's presence at her side than any change in Mrs. Pruitt's essential nature. The justice of the peace was a dry, meticulous man named Halverson, who witnessed the employment agreement with two of his office clerks signing below and then pressed his seal into the bottom of both copies without commentary, which Rowan appreciated. She kept one copy. Silas kept the other. On the way out, Mrs. Alderman caught them on the front step. She looked at the rolled paper in Rowan's hand and then at Silas, and then back at Rowan with the expression of a woman who has been watching situations unfold for 6 decades and knows what good ones look like. "Come for supper Sunday," she said to Rowan. "Bring the boy." It was not quite an invitation. It was more like a decision she had made on Rowan's behalf. Rowan found she didn't mind that at all. She had been at the ranch 11 days when the second problem arrived, and this one had a name and a story. A woman named Clara Webb appeared at the kitchen door on a Wednesday morning, late 30s, angular in the way, of someone who had been pretty once and now had more important things to do, with the look of someone who had come with something prepared to say. She identified herself as the wife of Frank Webb, who ran the cattle operation 2 miles to the east. She had brought a pie, which Rowan accepted because it would have been impolite not to, and they sat at the kitchen table while Eli drew on the back of an old supply receipt with a piece of charcoal Pete had given him. Clara made small conversation for approximately 2 minutes. Then she said, "I'll be honest with you, because I think you'd rather that." "I would," Rowan said. "There's talk in town," Clara said. "I'm not going to pretend you don't know that. Harrow's been around saying things about this arrangement, about you being here, and some people are listening more than they should." She looked at her own hands. "My husband thinks it's Harrow's business, which I disagree with. What happens on Silas's ranch is Silas's affair and nobody else's." "But," Rowan said, because there was clearly one. Clara looked up. "But some of the other wives are saying things I think you should know about. That you're here because of some," she picked the word with visible care, "informal understanding with Silas. That the boy might be—" She stopped. "Silas's," Rowan said flatly. Clara's jaw tightened. "I don't believe it. I want to be clear I don't believe it, but I think you should know what's being said." Rowan looked at her for a moment. She thought about the multiple ways she could respond to this. She thought about anger, which was available and not unreasonable. She thought about dismissal. She thought about the card in her coat pocket from Mrs. Alderman and the rolled contract in the top drawer of the office desk, and the 11 days she had spent building something in this house that was real and documented and witnessed. "Clara," she said, "how long have you been in this county?" 7 years, Clara said, a little surprised. "Do you know anyone who used to have a water dispute with Victor Harrow?" Clara looked at her. Something changed in her expression. Not suspicion, more like a door opening. "The Hallett family," she said slowly. "They sold out and left maybe 4 years ago. Some business with a legal complaint that dragged on until Thomas Hallett couldn't afford to fight anymore." She paused. "Why?" "I'm just building a picture," Rowan said. "How long did Harrow work on that?" Clara's eyes went careful. "Near on 2 years, I think." Rowan nodded. She pushed back her chair and picked up Eli's drawing. A horse, or maybe a wagon wheel, it was genuinely unclear, and smiled at him and ruffled his hair and put him down to go back to it. Then she looked at Clara. "I think you should tell your husband," she said, "and your neighbors, that whatever Harrow is saying about me is not about me. It's about that creek." Clara Webb sat very still. "And I think," Rowan continued, "that the best thing any of you can do for your own families, as much as for Silas, is to pay attention to what Harrow says next. Not to me, to Silas's land. Because if he wins here, he won't stop here." There was a long pause. "You figured that out in 11 days, Clara said. "I figured that out in the first 11 minutes, Rowan said. "Harrow rode up that road before I even knew where the barn was." Clara took a long drink of her coffee. She set the cup down. She looked at the rolled contract on the desk, which was visible through the open office door. "Is that what I think it is?" she said. "A formal employment agreement," Rowan said, "witnessed and sealed by Halverson." Clara made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Harrow's not going to like that." "No," Rowan agreed. "He's not." What happened next took 4 days. Rowan did not wait for Harrow to make his next move. She had never operated well in the position of waiting for something to happen to her. It was one of the things she knew about herself without pride or shame, just as fact. She was better when she was moving. She went back to the accounts first. She finished the audit she'd started in the first week, and produced a clean set of books going back to January. Every transaction reconciled, every missing entry reconstructed from the invoices she found in the desk drawers, organized by category and month. She presented it to Silas without fanfare. He stared at it for a while without speaking. "This took you 4 days," he said. 3.5, she said. He looked up at her. "This is the clearest these books have been in 5 years." She didn't say what she was thinking, which was that clear books were also defensible books, that if a legal challenge came and someone needed to demonstrate the legitimate operation of this ranch, they now had the paperwork to do it. She didn't say that because she thought he probably already knew it. She organized the supply orders next, identifying 3 vendors they were overpaying and 2 delivery contracts that could be restructured to save money over winter. She asked Calhoun where the maintenance records were kept for the equipment, and he showed her without commentary, and she worked through those too, flagging anything that might become an urgent repair before the real cold set in. Calhoun watched all of this with the expression of a man slowly revising something. "You're not going to last 3 weeks, he said one afternoon, not unkindly, more like he was talking to himself. She looked up from the maintenance record. "Why not?" "'Cause you're not actually a housekeeper," he said. "You're running a ranch office, and Silas is going to realize it and either promote you or feel uncomfortable, and either way, it gets complicated." She considered this. "Which do you think he'll do?" Calhoun's pause was the longest one yet. "Promote you," he said finally. "He's not a fool, even when he tries to be." That was, she thought, probably the most generous assessment she'd heard of anyone in months. The promotion, such as it was, happened without anyone formally naming it. She started attending the morning briefings Silas held with Pete and Calhoun, at first just to report on supply needs, and then gradually to contribute to the planning, and then to lead certain parts of it, specifically anything involving cost and scheduling. Neither ranch hand objected. Calhoun never did anything that surprised her anymore, and Pete was constitutionally incapable of unfriendliness. Silas gave her increasing authority over the household accounts, and then the operational ones, and she took on each new responsibility the way she'd taken on every other task here, immediately, completely, without making it a transaction. She also made herself visible in Ash Hollow. This was a deliberate choice, and she understood it as such. She went to town with Silas once a week for supplies. She attended the community meeting at the schoolhouse when Mrs. Alderman mentioned it. She talked to people. Not ingratiatingly, she wasn't capable of that and would have been seen through immediately, just honestly, as one person to another. She paid her tab at the store in full, on time, which she had noticed was not universal. She brought a pot of soup to the schoolteacher, Miss Hale, who had a cold in December and couldn't get out, and sat with her long enough to be genuinely helpful rather than performatively kind. She was building something. She knew she was building something. The question was whether she could build it fast enough. Harrow came to the ranch again on a Thursday in mid-December, and this time Silas was home. Rowan was in the office when she heard the voices in the yard, and she didn't move, not toward the door, not away from it. She sat at the desk with the ledger open and listened through the window, which was cold and single-paned and not designed for privacy. Harrow's voice was different when he was talking to Silas than it had been when he was talking to her. It was smoother, more layered. He had prepared something. He had, he said, spoken to the county clerk. He had reason to believe that the current arrangement at Boone Ranch, specifically the presence of an unattached woman with unclear legal standing, potentially complicated the terms of the original land grant. He had nothing against Silas, he said, genuinely and warmly, nothing at all. But as a concerned neighbor and member of the community, he felt it was his duty to flag that the situation might draw scrutiny from the county. He would hate for Silas to face difficulties that could have been avoided. Rowan listened to all of this. She waited. Silas's voice, when it came, was even. "I appreciate your concern, Victor. Rowan Mercer is a documented employee of this ranch. Her agreement is on file with Halverson's office." A silence. "Is it?" Harrow said. "It is." Another silence, longer this time. Then Harrow said something about the community's well-being and the importance of standards, and his voice had lost the smoothness, and Rowan heard the sound of a horse being turned and the retreating beat of hooves on the frozen road. Silas came into the office. He didn't sit down. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she looked back at him. He didn't know about the agreement, she said. He knows now. He'll try something else. He will, Silas said. He was quiet for a moment. I want you to know I'm not going to ask you to be less visible or keep quiet or anything like that. She hadn't expected him to, but she noted that he said it. Good, she said, because that's not something I'd do anyway. Something crossed his face, that serious version of the almost smile again. I know, he said, and left. She turned back to the ledger. Outside the window, the wind had picked up. December in this valley had a particular quality of menace. Not the violence of what was coming, not yet, but the gathering of it. The feeling of a system building itself over the mountains, patient and enormous and indifferent. She had noticed the change in the air 3 days ago. She'd been watching the animals since, noting the way the horses stood at the barn door differently in the last 48 hours, and the cattle moving to the lowest ground without being driven there. Something was coming. Something significant. She couldn't have said exactly what form it would take, whether it would be Harrow's next legal maneuver or the weather gathering weight over the peaks to the west or something else entirely that she hadn't accounted for yet. She had been wrong before, thinking she understood what shape trouble was about to take. She had been wrong about Douglas Fenn. She had been wrong about how quickly the women of Ash Hollow would come around. She had been wrong, in small ways, about Calhoun, and about how long it would take Pete to stop being nervous around her. But she had also learned, in the months since she'd climbed into a wagon with a quiet man whose hands were still on the reins, that being wrong about the shape of a thing didn't mean she was wrong about the existence of it. Something was coming. She closed the ledger and went to find Silas. There were things she needed to check in the barn, the roof bracing on the east side that Calhoun had mentioned in passing, the one that had been worrying her since she'd noted it in the maintenance records, the one that had been flagged once before and then forgotten. She needed to look at it herself. She needed to know what they were working with. She pulled her coat off the hook by the kitchen door and went out into the yard where the wind hit her immediately, cold and carrying something metallic in it, the smell of the air before serious snow. She stood in the yard for just a moment and looked up at the mountains to the west, at the particular color of the sky above them. Then she went to the barn. She didn't know yet what she would find there, in those roof beams, in that old forgotten corner of the east wall. She didn't know that the information she was walking toward, the knowledge she was building in her head about every inch of this ranch, every exit and entrance and weak point and structural vulnerability, that all of it was about to matter in a way she couldn't have predicted on a warm day, let alone a cold one. She just knew it needed checking, so she went and checked it. The east wall of the barn was worse than the maintenance record suggested. That was the thing about written records. They captured what someone noticed at the moment they were looking, which was not always the same as what was actually there. The entry Rowan had found in the maintenance log was 8 months old, made by a hand she didn't recognize, noting that the east roof brace showed somewhere and should be checked in spring. Spring had come and gone. Summer had come and gone. And no one had checked it. She stood inside the barn with a lantern held up and looked at the junction where the main support beam met the east wall. And what she saw made something go cold in her chest that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. The beam wasn't just worn, it had been sitting in moisture, a slow leak in the roof boards above it, small enough that you'd never notice from outside, persistent enough that over 18 months or 2 years it had worked into the wood like a secret. The base of the beam where it met the cross support was soft in a way that wood should not be soft. She pressed her thumb against it and felt it give more than it should. She did not panic. She stood there and looked at it and did the arithmetic in her head. How much weight that beam was responsible for, what section of roof it held, what would happen to that section in a significant snow load. She found Silas in the south pasture checking the fence line before dark. She told him what she'd found. She told it plainly, without drama, because drama about structural problems didn't make them less structural. And Silas was the kind of man who received plain information better than he received anything wrapped in alarm. He listened. He said he'd come look at it. He came, he looked, and his face did the thing that faces do when you are confirming something you were hoping to be wrong about. Calhoun saw this in April, he said. I know, he noted it. He told me about it. She waited. I meant to get to it, Silas said. Summer got complicated. She didn't ask what that meant. She had learned by now that summer got complicated, covered a range of things at Boone Ranch, some of them logistical, and some of them more personal, and none of them were her business unless they became her business. "We need to brace it from the inside," she said, "before the snow." "I know that," he said, with a sharpness that wasn't directed at her but landed near her. "I'm not saying you don't," she said. "I'm saying when." He looked at the beam again. He put his own hand against it, felt what she had felt. His jaw tightened. "This week," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. He looked at her. "The air smells like it did before the last big storm I was in," she said. "I grew up in eastern Colorado. I know that smell." He held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at the beam. "Tomorrow," he agreed. But tomorrow came with Harrow in it. The letter arrived in the Morning Post, delivered by the mail carrier who came out from Ash Hollow on Thursdays. It was addressed to Silas Boone and stamped with the return address of a law firm in Helena that Rowan didn't recognize. She brought it to the table at breakfast without opening it, which she wouldn't have done regardless, but she set it beside his coffee cup rather than leaving it on the hall table, which was her way of saying this one needed to be read now. He read it. His face didn't change much, but his hands went very flat and still on the table, which she had come to understand as his version of a significant reaction. "What is it?" she asked. He set the letter down. "Harrow's filed a formal complaint with the county. He's claiming that the terms of my original land grant, which included a provision about the property being maintained as a working family ranch, are being violated by the current living arrangement." He said this with a particular flatness. He's arguing that the presence of an unrelated woman and child constitutes a change in the household that voids the original grant terms. Rowan sat with that for a moment. "That's the thinnest legal argument I've ever heard," she said. "It doesn't have to be good," Silas said. "It just has to take long enough and cost enough that I can't fight it." She understood. She had understood since the conversation with Clara Webb, since the story of the Hallett family and their 2-year legal drain. Harrow wasn't trying to win in court. He was trying to make winning in court look like the only option Silas had, while bleeding him dry in the meantime. "We need to fix the barn today," she said. He looked at her. "Rowan, I know about the letter," she said. "But the barn is going to matter more than the letter in about 48 hours, if that smell in the air is what I think it is." She pushed back her chair. "You deal with the legal response. I'll start on the barn with Calhoun." "You're not—" "I'm not what?" she said, not unkindly. "Qualified? I've been looking at that beam for a week. I know what needs doing. You have a law firm in Helena to contact." She looked at him evenly. "Let me do what I can do." The pause that followed was long enough to be a conversation on its own. "Don't let Eli in the barn while you're working," he said. "I wasn't going to," she said. Calhoun received the news that they were bracing the east wall that day with the expression of a man who had been expecting to hear this for some time and was moderately relieved it was finally happening. Pete was put in charge of Eli, which Eli accepted as the best possible outcome. He spent the morning being introduced to the concept of oiling a harness and took to it with the focused seriousness of a child who has been given a real task. Rowan and Calhoun spent 4 hours on the barn. It was not elegant work. It was the kind of work that required crawling into spaces that weren't designed to be crawled into, holding things that were heavier than they looked, and having hands that were too cold to be fully reliable. Calhoun did not treat her like a liability. He treated her like a second pair of hands, which was accurate, and he directed the work with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it for decades and had stopped caring whether his collaborator was who he expected. By noon, they had a temporary cross brace installed below the compromise section and had identified 2 additional areas of softwood that would need proper replacement before spring. It wasn't a permanent fix, Calhoun was clear about that, but it was enough to hold significant additional weight without catastrophic failure. "How significant?" Rowan asked. Calhoun looked at the brace. "Heavy snow load, wind pressure from one side, maybe both at once if the storm's bad enough." He ran his hand along the new timber. "Not going to lie to you. If it's a bad one, we should probably move the horses to the main pasture shelter." "If we have time," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You really think it's coming?" "Don't you?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "I do." Silas came back from town at 4 in the afternoon, looking like he had fought something and not entirely won. He'd spent 3 hours with a lawyer named Greer, who had an office above the hardware store, and whose opinion of Harrow's legal complaint was apparently mixed. Not that it was valid, but that in the current county administration, with a clerk who owed Harrow a favor, it could produce delays in hearings that would take months to resolve. They needed documentation. They needed witnesses. They needed to demonstrate, formally and publicly, exactly what the arrangement at Boone Ranch was, and had been, since Rowan arrived. He sat at the kitchen table and told her this while she put food in front of him that he didn't immediately eat. "What kind of witnesses?" she asked. "People who can testify to your role here, what you actually do, that it's a legitimate employment arrangement." She thought about Mrs. Alderman. She thought about Clara Webb. She thought about the Sunday supper 3 weeks ago, where she'd sat across from 7 women from neighboring ranches and talked about winter food preservation and the best way to treat a horse's cracked hooves, and had, without planning to, built the beginning of something. "I can get witnesses," she said. "Rowan, it's not just, this is going to be uncomfortable. Harrow has people in that town who will say whatever he wants them to say. It could get ugly." "I know what ugly looks like," she said. "I've been looking at it since I got off that train." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face that was harder to read than his usual expressions. Not the tired practicality she'd gotten used to, something more complicated than that. Something she didn't have a name for yet. "I know you have," he said quietly. She let that sit. Then she picked up his fork and put it in his hand because the food was going cold. And he looked down at it and then actually ate, which she took as a minor victory. The sky on the 14th of December turned a color that Rowan had no good name for. It wasn't gray. It was something more absolute than gray, a kind of dense white yellow that flattened all the shadows and made the mountains to the west disappear one layer at a time into the approaching mass. She stood in the yard at 7 in the morning and watched it and felt the wind, which had changed direction in the night and was coming now from the northwest, steady and purposeful. She went back inside and woke everyone. Silas was already awake. Calhoun had been up since 5. Pete needed 2 calls but came down the stairs pulling his coat on, still half asleep, and became fully awake when he stepped outside and saw the sky. "That's a serious storm," he said. Not to anyone in particular, just the acknowledgement of something that required acknowledging. "Yes," Rowan said. "Here's what I think we need to do." Silas looked at her. Calhoun looked at her. Pete looked at her and then at the other 2 to see how they were taking it. She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it for 2 days, in the back of her mind while she worked on the accounts and the witness documentation and the 100 other things that needed doing. She had mentally walked through the property and identified every decision point, every place where the next hour's choice would affect the next 12 hours' outcome. "The horses need to go to the pasture shelter," she said. "Not the barn. The east brace will hold, but I don't want to stake 11 horses on it if we don't have to. The cattle are already low. Leave them. The supply shed on the north side needs the door reinforced. That latch has been loose since I got here, and a hard wind will take it. And someone needs to get to the Webbs and the Aldersons and tell them what's coming if they don't already know." A pause. "The Aldersons are 3 miles out," Calhoun said. "I know," she said. Another pause. Silas looked at the sky again, then at Calhoun. Then he said, "Pete, take the horses. Calhoun, the supply shed. I'll ride to the Aldersons." "I'll do the latch and then start on food and water stores," Rowan said. "We should assume 2 days minimum." 3, Calhoun said. 3, she agreed. They split without further discussion. What? The storm announced itself at 10:13 in the morning. Rowan knew the exact time because she had been standing at the kitchen window watching the yard, monitoring the change in the way the air was moving, and she checked the clock on the wall when the first serious gust hit. The one that wasn't wind so much as pressure, the kind that pushes rather than pulls, that gets into the spaces between things. The temperature outside had dropped 8 degrees in the previous 2 hours. The snow started 11 minutes later. Not the polite kind. Not the pretty kind that comes in big slow flakes and settles decorously. This came sideways, dense and small, and driven by a wind that had committed to its direction. Within 20 minutes, the yard was gone. Not covered, gone, replaced by a moving white that had no definition and no edges. Eli was inside. She had already moved his sleeping pallet into the main room, closer to the large fireplace, and stocked the wood box twice over. I was drawing on his supply receipts with his charcoal and had discovered, in the way that 3-year-olds discover things with absolute certainty, that drawing horses was better than drawing anything else. Pete came in from the pasture shelter at 10:40, coated in white from his hat to his boots, reporting the horses moved, and the shelter latched from both inside and outside. "You okay?" she asked him. "Yeah," he said, but his hands were shaking when he took the coffee she held out, and she noted that and said nothing because he was 23 and doing a man's job in a serious storm and didn't need her to make an issue of what his hands were doing. Calhoun came in at 11. The north shed was secured. He'd also reinforced the barn door on the west side, which hadn't been on the list, but he'd seen it starting to move and dealt with it without being asked, which was vintage Calhoun. Silas wasn't back yet. She watched the window. She kept moving. Food, water, fuel, because standing still was not something she could afford right now, not with Eli in the next room needing her calm to stay calm himself. But she watched the window. He came in at 11:30, and she heard the door before she saw him, the particular sound of someone fighting wind resistance just to get through a doorway. She was in the hall when he came in, and he was soaked through his coat and his face was red from the cold, and there was ice in his beard that she had not previously known he had enough beard to hold ice. "Aldersons are fine," he said. "Warned them." He was already looking past her into the main room. "Where's—" "Drawing horses," she said. "He's fine." Something in Silas's shoulders came down about an inch. By noon the storm was the loudest thing Rowan had ever been inside. That was the only way she could describe it. Not that it was loud outside, but that she was inside the sound, surrounded by it, the way you are inside a sound when you're standing in it rather than hearing it from a distance. The wind against the roof was constant and variable at the same time, rising and falling in a rhythm that had no predictability. She was in the kitchen when she heard the first crack from the barn. It was not a small sound. It was the specific sound of wood under load making a decision, and everyone in the house heard it. Calhoun was on his feet before she was. Silas was already at the door. "The east brace," she said. "Might be," Calhoun said. "Or the door." "Go around the south side," Silas said, already pulling his coat on. "The south door should be." "I'm coming," Rowan said. "Rowan." "I know that barn better than Pete does right now," she said. "And Pete needs to stay with Eli." She was pulling on her own coat as she said it, and her voice did not offer the sentence as a negotiation. Silas looked at her. The storm was telling them they did not have the time this conversation would take if she needed to win it. "South door," he said. "Stay with me." They went out. The world between the house and the barn was not navigable the way a world is supposed to be navigable. It was 30 yards, and it took them more than 2 minutes, leaning into wind that had physicality to it, that pushed back with something that felt almost deliberate. She kept her hand on Silas's coat and her eyes on what she could see of the ground and moved. The south door of the barn was intact. They got through it. Inside, the noise was different, muffled from outside, replaced by the sound of the building itself under stress. The roof shuddered. Somewhere above them, something shifted and resettled with a sound that made Silas stop moving for just a moment. The east section, the one with the repaired brace, was holding. She could see that immediately. What had cracked was something else, something further along the north wall, a secondary roof beam she had noted in the maintenance records but hadn't flagged as urgent. She had been wrong about the priority. She had been wrong, and she felt it as a specific and usable piece of information rather than an occasion for self-recrimination, because there was no time for self-recrimination. "That beam," she said to Silas, pointing, "it's going to pull the north wall section if it goes." "I see it," he said. He was already moving toward it, which was the wrong direction. "Silas!" The second crack was louder. It happened very fast and also very slow in the way that dangerous things happen. She saw the beam shift. She saw Silas below it. She saw the cascade of smaller boards and roof material beginning to come down on the east side of where he was standing. He moved, but not far enough and not fast enough, and the edge of what came down caught him across the left shoulder and drove him sideways into the wall, and then the debris was between them and she couldn't see him. She heard him. "I'm down," he said. Not screaming, just saying it. "Left arm, something's on me." She forced herself to stop, to think, not to move toward him through the debris in the dark without a plan, because moving without a plan in a situation like this was how you made it worse. She had the lantern. She held it up. The section that had come down was substantial, not the full north wall, but enough. Roof boards and the broken beam collapsed at an angle that had pinned him, or partially pinned him. She couldn't see exactly. She could hear him breathing, which was the most important piece of information available. "Can you move your feet?" she called. A pause. "Yes." "Arms?" "Right arm, yes. Left arm." Another pause, shorter. "I don't know." "Don't try to move," she said. She looked at the debris. She looked at where he was relative to the collapse. She looked at the space around her, and she was already thinking, not panicking, thinking, about angles and weight, and how you moved something heavy off a person without bringing more heavy things down in the process. And then she remembered the passage. She almost hadn't. It had been her first week before she knew anything about this ranch, except what she could observe in an hour at a time. And she had been doing what she always did in a new place, walking through it, mapping it, filing away everything that might someday matter. She had found it behind the stacked crates on the east wall, barely a passage at all, more like a channel between the original barn wall and a later addition, just wide enough for a person to move through sideways. She had asked Calhoun about it, and he had said it was from the original construction, used to run a secondary drainage pipe, and that nobody used it anymore. She had nodded and filed it. She ran to it now. The crates had shifted in the collapse but hadn't blocked the entrance entirely. She moved two of the smaller ones, which was hard and took longer than she wanted, and then she was through the gap, moving sideways in the dark with the lantern held at arm's length in front of her. The passage curved slightly and then opened into the space behind the north wall section, behind the collapse, not in front of it. Silas was there. He was sitting up against the wall with debris across his left side and his right hand braced against a roof board that was at a bad angle. He had blood on his face from something she hadn't heard happen, and his left arm was folded against his chest at a way that told her something in it was unhappy. He looked up and saw her come through the wall, essentially, from a direction that didn't make sense from where he'd last seen her standing. He stared. "Service passage," she said, already moving toward him, setting the lantern down and assessing the debris on his left side. "I found it the first week. Don't move." "How did you—" he started. "I walk through new places and I remember what I find," she said. "It's just something I do." She had her hands on the largest board on top of him now, testing the weight. "When I say 3, push the smaller board with your right hand and roll toward me. Ready? Rowan, the roof is not going to come down in the next 30 seconds, she said. She did not actually know this with certainty. Ready? Ready, he said. 1, 2, 3. She lifted. He pushed and rolled. The board moved. He came clear of the debris and she caught him. Not gracefully. His weight was significantly more than she'd accounted for. And they both went sideways against the passage wall, and she took his weight with her shoulder in a way that was going to hurt later. She didn't let go. "Walk," she said. "I've got you. The passage opens on the east side. Watch your head at the end." He walked. She steadied him. They moved through the channel in the dark, and the wind screamed at the roof above them. And somewhere the barn made another sound of stressed wood, and she kept them moving. They came through the east opening of the passage into the barn's main space, and then toward the south door, and then they were outside in the storm, which was terrible, and then they were inside the house, and the door was shut. Pete saw them come in, and he was on his feet immediately, which she was grateful for because Silas needed to be sat down before he fell down. Eli looked up from his horses. "Silas hurt?" he said. "A little," Rowan said. "He's going to be fine." She looked at Silas to make sure this was true. He was pale under the cold flush, and his left arm was cradled against himself, but his eyes were clear, and he was tracking everything, and the blood on his face was from a cut above his eyebrow that bled thoroughly the way head cuts do, but was not deep. "Your arm," she said. "I can move it," he said. "Mostly. Something in the shoulder." "Not broken?" He moved it cautiously. His face made its controlled reaction to pain. "Dislocated, maybe, or near it." She had managed a dislocated shoulder once, her cousin's, after a fall from a horse. She had been 17. She remembered what her uncle had done, more or less. She looked at Silas's face to see if she should say this. "Calhoun," she said instead. "Have you ever relocated a shoulder?" Calhoun, who had been standing very still in the doorway, said, "Once. On Pete, actually." "Hey," Pete said, mildly offended. "Can you do it again?" I think so. She looked at Silas. He looked back at her. He nodded once. Eli, she said, turning to her son, come sit with me for a minute. She sat on the floor next to him and helped him draw a horse while Calhoun dealt with Silas's shoulder in the next room. When it happened, there was a sound, and then Silas's voice saying something low and sharp, and then quiet. Eli looked up. What was that? Calhoun fixed something, she said. Like a squeaky hinge? She looked at her son, his complete trusting certainty that things got fixed, that squeaky hinges were addressed, that the adults around him were handling whatever needed handling. Yes, she said, just like that. The storm ran for 31 hours. It was not, in the end, the worst storm the valley had seen, though it was not far off. 2 feet of snow in the high areas. Drifts against the buildings that required serious excavation before any of the doors could be opened from the outside. The temperature dropped to levels that made all outdoor work a medical question as much as a practical one. Inside Boone Ranch, they managed. The east brace held. The repair she and Calhoun had made held. The north wall section that had collapsed was a loss. It would need to be rebuilt in spring, but it had come down in the one direction that didn't bring the rest of the roof with it. On the second day, when the wind had dropped enough to make the yard navigable, she dug out the south door of the barn with Pete, and they assessed the damage in daylight. The north wall section was gone. One support beam was kindling. The rest of the structure was sound. She stood inside the barn and looked at what had happened and where, and she traced the path she had taken through the passage with her eyes. Where she'd gone in, where she'd come through, where Silas had been sitting. She looked at the angle of the roof that had come down and where it would have continued to come if they hadn't moved when they did. Pete was beside her, quiet for once. You went through the wall for him, he said. I went through the passage, she said. We didn't know that passage existed, he said. She looked at him. I know. He thought about this for a moment. How did you know it? I walked every inch of this barn my first week here, she said. I walk through new places. Pete looked at the passage entrance, barely visible, behind the shifted crates. He looked at the debris on the north side. He looked at where Silas had been. Okay, he said. He said it like a man revising a whole collection of opinions at once. Silas's shoulder had not fully dislocated. Calhoun had been right to try, and what he'd done had been sufficient for now, though the arm would need rest and proper attention when the roads cleared and a doctor could come from town. He was in the main room on the morning of the second day, his left arm in a sling that Rowan had fashioned from a linen tablecloth, drinking coffee with his right hand and being visibly frustrated by the limitation. She sat across from him with her own coffee. I owe you more than I know how to say, he said. You don't owe me anything, she said. I work here. Rowan. He said her name the way he had before, with that particular weight. We got lucky with this passage, she said. I happened to have found it. In a different barn I wouldn't have known. But you looked, he said. You looked for it on purpose. First week. I look for things, she said. Exits, weak points, things that might matter later. She looked at her coffee. I've had enough situations where not knowing cost me something to stop taking it on faith that I'll figure it out in the moment. He was quiet for a long time. Who taught you that? He asked. She thought about it honestly. Getting it wrong enough times, she said. He nodded, like that was the truest answer she could have given. Outside, the snow had stopped. The world was white and enormous and very still, in the particular way it goes still after a serious storm, as if it needs a moment to take inventory of itself. The mountains to the west were back, enormous and clear, every line of them sharpened by the fresh snow. Calhoun was outside already, moving through the yard with the purposeful economy that was his only mode of existing, checking every structure. Pete was with Eli, who had discovered that snow was something you could throw at people, and was exercising this discovery with considerable enthusiasm. She could hear her son's laughter through the window. She looked at Silas. He was looking toward the window too, toward the sound of it. He's going to be all right here, Silas said. He said it carefully, not as a guarantee, just as what he believed. I know, she said. She had known it for a while. She had just been waiting to let herself know it out loud. The window showed her the yard, white and blown and transformed from what it had been, and 2 ranch hands and a 3-year-old boy in the middle of it, and the mountains above all of it standing as they had stood through 100 years of storms like this one and would stand through 100 more. There was still Harrow. There was still the legal complaint and the county clerk and the long, exhausting argument that Harrow was prepared to sustain for as long as it took. She hadn't forgotten any of that. She wasn't built to forget that kind of thing. But the barn had held. The horses were safe. The man who had stopped his wagon at a dark train station because a boy shouldn't sleep in the cold was sitting across from her with a sling made from a tablecloth, and both of them were alive. And the storm had passed, and the roads would eventually clear, and whatever came next, she could see it. She could meet it. That was enough for this morning. The roads cleared on the third day after the storm, and the first person through them was not the Dr. Silas needed for his shoulder. It was Clara Webb. She came up the ranch road in her husband's wagon, with Frank Webb driving and two other women from neighboring properties sitting in the back. Margaret Alderson, whose husband Silas had ridden to warn before the storm hit, and a quieter woman named Dora Purcell, who ran a small sheep operation 4 miles to the south, and whom Rowan had met exactly once, briefly, at Mrs. Alderman's Sunday supper. Rowan saw the wagon from the kitchen window and went to the door. Clara was down from the seat before the wagon fully stopped, which told Rowan this was not a casual visit. She had the focused energy of a woman who had decided something during a long storm and had been waiting for passable roads to act on it. "We heard about the barn," Clara said, coming up the porch steps. "And about Silas." "He's all right," Rowan said. "Shoulder. Doctor's coming this afternoon from town." "Good." Clara stopped at the top step and looked at her directly. "We also heard what you did." Rowan held the door open. "Come in out of the cold." They came in. All 4 of them, Frank Webb included, though he took his hat off at the door in the way of a man who understands he is in the presence of a conversation that belongs to the women and has decided to be respectful about it. Rowan put coffee on, which was the correct response to any number of situations in this part of the world, and they settled around the kitchen table, and for a moment nobody said the thing they had come to say. It was Dora Purcell who said it first, which surprised Rowan because she'd had the impression Dora was quiet, in the way of someone who spoke rarely and meant it when she did. "Pete told my husband," Dora said, "about the passage, about how you got to Silas." Rowan poured coffee into cups she set out. "Pete talks a lot." "He does," Clara said. "In this case, I'm glad of it." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Rowan, what Harrow is doing, the legal complaint, the things he's been saying in town, we want to help." Rowan sat down. She looked at the 4 of them. "What kind of help?" "Testimony," Clara said. "Frank knows the justice of the peace. Not Halverson, the other one, Patterson, who sits on the county commission. If we go to Patterson with a formal account of what you did here, what you've been doing since you arrived, the kind of woman you actually are versus what Harrow's been saying." "It helps," Rowan said. "It more than helps," Clara said. "Patterson has been looking for a reason to look at Harrow's history of complaints for 2 years. Everyone knows what happened with the Hallets. Nobody's been willing to be the first to say it officially." Rowan looked at Frank Webb, who had been silent. "And you're willing?" Frank turned his hat in his hands. He was a compact man with a weathered face and the kind of eyes that had spent a long time looking at distances. "Harrow tried the same thing with us 4 years ago," he said, "before the Hallets. We settled, and I've regretted it." He looked at his wife and then back at Rowan. "I'm not settling again." Something in Rowan's chest shifted. Not relief, not yet. She was too experienced with situations that looked good in the kitchen and complicated in the courthouse to call it relief. But something. "I need to talk to Silas," she said. "Of course," Clara said. "And I need to know exactly what you're willing to say and how much of your own history with Harrow you're willing to put on record. Because if we do this, we do it completely. Halfway testimony is worse than none." Clara and Frank looked at each other. "Completely," Frank said. Silas was in the main room with his arm in the linen sling, going through the operation ledger with his right hand in the way of a man who cannot stand to be unproductive even when his body is suggesting he try. He looked up when Rowan came in, and she could see he already knew the Webbs were there. The house wasn't big enough for secrets. She told him what Clara had said. She told it straight through without editorial, the same way she told him everything. And when she was done, he was quiet for a moment with his right hand flat on the ledger. "Patterson," he said. "You know him?" "I know he's honest," Silas said. "More than Halverson, who is also honest but careful." Patterson is honest without being careful, which in this situation is more useful. He shifted his arm and made a controlled sound about it. What does Greer say? I haven't talked to Greer yet. I wanted to talk to you first. He looked at her. This was still something he was getting used to, being consulted before decisions were made rather than after, having someone in the house who moved through problems with the same deliberateness he tried to and sometimes managed. We should go to Greer, he said, tomorrow if the road holds, with Frank and Clara. Mrs. Alderman too, Rowan said. She knows more about the history of this county than Greer does. She's been here 40 years. She'll come if you ask her, Silas said. She has a particular opinion of Harrow that she's never been given occasion to state officially. How particular? Silas's face made the serious version of the almost smile. Very. The doctor came from town at 3 that afternoon, a man named Birch, who smelled like pipe tobacco and had the manner of someone who had been dealing with frontier injuries long enough to be unimpressed by most of them. He examined Silas's shoulder for approximately 4 minutes, confirmed it was a partial dislocation that Calhoun had partially corrected, adjusted it the rest of the way with a sound that made Pete leave the room, and told Silas the arm needed 3 weeks of minimal use, which he said in the tone of a man who already knows he's being ignored. Silas paid him. Rowan walked him to the door. That shoulder's going to heal fine, Birch said quietly at the door, pulling on his coat. But you might tell him that I said so, because he doesn't seem inclined to believe it from me. He doesn't like being limited, she said. No, Birch said, looking at her with the sharp assessment of someone in a profession where reading people quickly is professionally necessary. I heard about what happened in that barn. A pause. Quick thinking. I got lucky, she said. He gave her the look of a man who did not accept that explanation but had places to be. Sure, he said, and left. The meeting with Greer happened 2 days later, in the lawyer's office above the hardware store, with 6 people sitting in chairs that had not been designed for this number. Greer was a man who communicated primarily through his eyebrows. They rose and fell in response to new information with a precision that suggested he had developed this as a deliberate alternative to saying things he wasn't ready to commit to yet. He listened to Frank Webb's account of the complaint Harrow had filed 4 years ago, the settlement he'd been pressured into, and the pattern of implied threats that had preceded it, and his eyebrows did a great deal of work. Then he listened to Dora Purcell, who had brought her husband Amos, and whose account was different in detail but identical in structure. A legal challenge filed through the county on a technical pretext, pressure applied through community reputation rather than explicit threat. A resolution that benefited Harrow without requiring him to win anything in court. Mrs. Alderman had come. She sat in the corner with her hands in her lap and said nothing until Greer looked at her and said, "And you, Mrs. Alderman?" "I have lived in this county for 41 years, she said. "I knew Victor Harrow's father, who was not a good man, and I have watched Victor become a version of his father that is more sophisticated but not more decent." She said this with the calm of someone delivering a prepared statement. They have been composing for a long time. I can name 4 families who left this valley in the last 10 years who I believe left because of deliberate pressure from Harrow's operation. I can name the dates, the properties, and the approximate circumstances of each departure. She opened the small bag on her lap and produced a folded paper. I wrote it down. Greer's eyebrows reached a new altitude. "Mrs. Alderman," he said carefully, "have you had this written down for some time?" "Since the Hallets left," she said. "I was waiting for someone to ask." Rowan looked at this woman, this round, sharp-eyed woman in her housecoat who had pressed a card into her hand on a cold night 6 weeks ago and told her to come day or night if anything was wrong, and felt something that had no clean name, something between gratitude and recognition. The recognition of someone who has been waiting in their own way, holding their own kind of knowledge, for the moment when it would be useful. They had both been building something. In different places and over very different timelines, they had both been building something. Greer said he needed 3 days to review everything and draft a formal response to Harrow's complaint. He said the response would include a petition to the county commission to reopen the prior complaint resolutions involving the Webb and Purcell properties, which would expand the scope of the proceeding from Harrow versus Boone Ranch to something considerably broader. "Will Patterson accept it?" Silas asked. Greer considered. Patterson has been looking for a procedurally correct way to do something about Harrow for 2 years. We are providing him a procedurally correct way. He looked at all of them. Yes, I believe he'll accept it. On the way out, Clara caught Rowan's arm in the narrow stairwell. Not urgently, just the touch of one person stopping another because there's something to say. I want to apologize, Clara said, for what I told you, about what was being said in town. I should have pushed back harder when I heard it. You came and told me, Rowan said. That was more than most people would have done. It wasn't enough. Clara, Rowan looked at her. You're here now, that's enough. Clara held her gaze for a moment, then nodded, and they went down the stairs and out into the cold afternoon where the wagon was waiting and the mountains were bright with fresh snow above the town. Harrow found out about the meeting, of course. She hadn't expected otherwise. A town of 300 people in the middle of winter had no mechanism for privacy. She assumed he knew within 24 hours, and she was probably right, because 36 hours after the meeting at Greer's office, a man appeared at the ranch gate on a horse that wasn't Harrow's, but that had the look of Harrow's stable. He was young, mid-20s, with the expression of someone who has been sent to do something they've been told is simple. He asked to speak to Silas. Silas came out to the gate, arm in sling, and listened. The message, delivered with the slightly stilted quality of something memorized, was that Mr. Harrow was prepared to withdraw the current county complaint in exchange for a quiet resolution of the water rights question. Specifically, an agreement allowing Harrow access to the lower creek during the summer irrigation period. Silas stood at the gate in the cold and listened to this, and then said, "Tell Mr. Harrow I appreciate him passing that along." The young man waited. "And?" "That's all," Silas said. "Tell him I appreciate it." Rowan was watching from the porch. She watched the young man register that this was not the conversation he'd expected, and then turn his horse and go. And then she watched Silas stand at the gate for a moment in the cold before turning back. "He's scared," Silas said when he came up the porch steps. "Yes," she said. "He wouldn't offer the withdrawal otherwise." "No," she said. "He wouldn't." Silas looked at the road where the young man had gone. His jaw was doing the tight thing it did when he was thinking about something he found genuinely difficult. "Rowan, if I take the deal, the complaint goes away. We don't have to go through the county hearing. Nobody else has to put their name on anything." "Silas," she said. He stopped. "If you take the deal, you give him the creek access," she said, "and he wins the thing he wanted. The complaint was never the point. The complaint was the pressure." She looked at him steadily. "And Frank Webb loses his chance to put what happened to him on record, and Dora Purcell loses hers, and the next family Harrow targets, and there will be a next family, will have no record showing what he does." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. "I know all of that," Silas said quietly. He stopped again, rubbed the back of his neck with his good hand. "I'm tired, Rowan. I've been fighting this particular piece of ground for 2 years, and I'm tired." She looked at him. Not critically, she understood tired. She had been tired in ways this man hadn't yet been required to be, and she didn't hold it against him that the exhaustion was real. "I know," she said. "I know you are." She let that sit for a moment. "But you stopped at a train station because a boy shouldn't sleep in the cold. That was tiredness talking, that decision, or was that just you?" He looked at her. "That was just me," he said. "Then so is this," she said. He stood on the porch in the January cold with his arm in a sling made from her tablecloth and the mountains behind the ranch bright and impossible and enormous. And he didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "I'm sending the message back that the answer is no." "Good," she said. "You should know it's going to get harder before it gets easier." "I've been acquainted with that concept for a while," she said. Something in his expression shifted in a way that was different from the almost smiles, different from the recognition she'd seen before. She noted it and didn't examine it right now because there were things to do, and she had learned that things which needed examining had a way of waiting for the right moment if you let them. "What?" Harrow's response to the refusal came not through a messenger but through the town itself, which was smarter and more unpleasant. Within a week, Rowan began hearing things through the various channels that small-town life provides, from Mrs. Alderman, from Clara, from Pete who picked things up at the feed supply when he went for grain. The story circulating now was different from the one about her uncertain status. This one was about the barn. The version Harrow's people were telling was that Rowan had known about the structural problem in the barn for weeks and had failed to report it adequately, and that her negligence had resulted in Silas being injured. It was a story built from real pieces rearranged into a false shape. She had known about the beam, she had told Silas. They had braced it, and still the north wall had come down. The details were accurate. The implication was a fabrication. She heard this on a Tuesday. She sat with it until Wednesday morning, which was how long it took her to understand exactly what Harrow was doing. He wasn't trying to win the county hearing. He couldn't win the county hearing now, not with Frank Webb's testimony and Mrs. Alderman's written record and the broader investigation that Patterson had opened. He was trying to make the cost of winning high enough that people chose something else. He was trying to break the coalition. She went to Silas on Wednesday morning before breakfast. "I need to go to town," she said. He looked at her over his coffee. His arm was out of the sling now, cautiously. Birch had said 3 weeks. It had been 12 days, and Silas had decided 12 days was close enough. What happened? She told him what was being said. His face did the thing. The still hands, the tight jaw. "He's trying to turn the neighbors," she said. "If Clara starts to wonder if she's putting her name on something that gets complicated, if Frank starts to worry about liability for the Webb property, the coalition loses its foundation." "I know what he's doing," Silas said. "Then you know why I need to go to town today." "What are you going to do?" She picked up her coat from the hook. "I'm going to talk to people," she said. "That's all. I'm just going to talk to people." She drove herself, which was a statement as much as a practical decision. She went to the feed supply first, because Pete was right that it was where people talked, and she walked in and bought the grain she had already noted they needed. And she talked to the man behind the counter whose name was Garrett, in the same way she'd been talking to people in this town for 6 weeks, directly, without performing anything. Garrett brought it up himself, which she'd expected. "Heard there was some trouble out at Boone's place." "There was," she said. "Storm damage. Silas got caught under some debris when the north wall came down." "Heard it was a beam that was known about," Garrett said. He was watching her. "It was," she said. "I found it my first week and reported it. We braced it. The brace held. The east section that we repaired did not fail. What failed was a different section of the north wall that was lower on the priority list." She looked at him steadily. "If you're asking whether I missed something that led to Silas getting hurt, the answer is probably yes. I prioritized the wrong section. That's on me. What's not accurate is that I knew and said nothing." Garrett blinked. He had not expected her to say that's on me. "The brace you put in held?" he said. "Through the worst of the storm," she said. "Calhoun can tell you the same." She paid for the grain. She went to Mrs. Pruitt's general store, where Mrs. Pruitt was initially her usual careful self, and then, after approximately 5 minutes of conversation, measurably less so. She went to Miss Hale at the schoolhouse, who was fully recovered from her cold, and who received Rowan with the warmth of someone who remembers a pot of soup brought on a difficult day. She went to Mrs. Alderman last. Mrs. Alderman was expecting her, because Mrs. Alderman seemed to exist in a state of permanent preparedness for whatever was about to happen. "Sit down," Mrs. Alderman said. "I made tea." Rowan sat down. She realized tired. Not the deep structural exhaustion that Silas carried. Hers was more recent and more specific. The tiredness of someone who had been building something carefully for 6 weeks and was now watching someone try to dismantle it and was having to decide in real time how much energy she had to defend it. "He's not going to win," Mrs. Alderman said, pouring tea with the calm of someone stating a weather fact. "He might not need to," Rowan said. "He just needs to make enough noise that people step back." "He needs to make enough noise that you step back," Mrs. Alderman said with precision. "Everyone else in this is following your lead. You're the new piece. You're what changed the situation." Rowan looked at her. "That's not a comfortable thought." "No," Mrs. Alderman agreed, "but it's accurate." She set the teapot down. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask," Rowan said. "What did you want when you got on that train, before the man who was supposed to meet you didn't?" Rowan thought about it honestly, because Mrs. Alderman was the kind of person you owed honest answers to. "Safety," she said. "For Eli. Stability. A place where we weren't starting over every year." She looked at the tea in her cup. "I wasn't looking for anything grand. I just wanted to stop being so close to the edge all the time. And now? Rowan was quiet for a moment. Now I want to win, she said. And she said it with a flatness that surprised even herself. Not anger, not ambition, something quieter and more durable. Not for the sake of winning, because Harrow has done this to people who didn't deserve it and gotten away with it, and I have the specific misfortune of being the person who currently has the best chance of making that stop. Mrs. Alderman studied her. That's an unusual way to think about misfortune, she said. It's the way it is, Rowan said. What? The county commission hearing was scheduled for the second week of February, which gave Harrow 5 weeks to do whatever he was going to do and gave Rowan's side 5 weeks to be ready for it. She used all 5 weeks. She worked with Greer on the documentation, going through the formal record of her employment and the ranch's operational history with the meticulous attention she'd brought to the original ledger audit. She helped Frank Webb organize his account of the prior complaint into a coherent written statement. She drove twice more to Mrs. Alderman's house to review the older woman's written record and fill in gaps from conversations she had with other long-term residents of the county. She maintained the ranch. She kept the books. She fed people. She fixed a fence section that the storm had damaged on the south pasture side, and she patched the kitchen roof where a shingle had gone, and she organized the spring supply order 2 months early because it was going to be a complicated spring and having that done in advance would matter. She also, in the evenings after Eli was down, sat at the kitchen table and wrote letters. Not to anyone connected to the legal case. To her cousin Margaret in Spokane, who she hadn't written since before the storm. To a woman she'd worked alongside briefly in Colorado, who had relocated to Billings and whose husband, as it happened, had a peripheral connection to the county land office. Not asking for anything specific, just maintaining connections, keeping threads live that might someday be useful or might not. She had learned to keep threads live. Silas came into the kitchen one evening in late January and found her writing and stood in the doorway for a moment before she looked up. "Sorry," he said. "I thought you'd gone up." "Not yet," she said. "Come in." He came in and sat down across from her, which he did sometimes in the evenings. Not talking necessarily, just occupying the same space while she worked or he read. She had come to understand it as his version of company, the way some people needed noise and other people needed presence without obligation. Tonight he didn't read. He looked at the letters. "You're building something," he said. "I'm always building something," she said. "I've noticed," he said. Not critically. More the way you observe the weather, a statement of fact about the world you're living in. She looked at him. He looked back. This had been happening more, conversations that had a different quality from the practical ones, that existed in a space that didn't have a clean function. "Silas," she said. "Yeah. When this is over." She stopped. He waited. "I don't know what I'm trying to say," she said, which was rare enough for her to be notable. "I've been thinking about what happens after, whether I stay in the same capacity or I don't know what else it would be, but it would be something different, and I don't know if that's—" "Rowan," he said. She stopped. "One thing at a time," he said. He said it gently, which was not his dominant register, but he was capable of it. "Let's get through February." She looked at him. Something in her loosened slightly that had been very tightly held for a long time. Not everything, not the whole structure, just one particular place. "All right," she said. "February." He went to bed. She finished her letters and folded them and addressed them and left them by the door for the morning post. Outside the kitchen window. The January dark was complete and cold, and the ranch was quiet in all the ways, as it was quiet at night. The horses in the barn, the cattle in the low field, the snow on the mountains holding its accumulated weight until the spring decided to arrive and take it back. She sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen. She thought about the platform in November, the cold and the dark and the folded note and $42 and Eli's hands fisted in her collar. She thought about how far that place was from this one. Not in miles, not exactly, but in the more meaningful measurement of what you have and what you know and who is in the next room. She was not the same person who had stepped off that train. She had not expected to be. She had expected to be harder, maybe. That was usually what survival produced. But sitting in this kitchen with the ranch quiet around her and the letters stacked by the door and the case files organized in the office and the ledger balanced and the spring supplies ordered 2 months early, what she felt was not hard. What she felt was ready. Ready for February. Ready for Harrow's last move, whatever shape it took. Ready for the county commission and the witnesses and the procedurally correct reckoning that Mrs. Alderman had been holding in a folded paper since the Hallets left. Ready for whatever came after that, too. One thing at a time, he had said. She blew out the kitchen lamp. She went upstairs. The morning of the county commission hearing, Rowan burned the toast. It was not a metaphor. She genuinely burned it. Stood at the stove thinking about the order of testimony Greer had outlined and forgot the bread on the iron, and the smell brought her back to the kitchen with a start, and she pulled the pan off the heat and stood there looking at two black rectangles that had been breakfast. Eli wandered in from the main room in his socks. "Smells bad," he said helpfully. "It does," she agreed. He looked at the burned toast with the solemn assessment of a 3-year-old encountering a problem. "Can we have eggs?" "Yes," she said. "We can have eggs." She made eggs. Her hands were steady, which she noted because she had half expected them not to be. She was not a person who showed nerves in her hands as a rule, but today felt like an occasion that might override her rules. Silas came downstairs and looked at the pan in the sink and the eggs on the stove and said nothing about the burned toast, which was the correct response. He poured his own coffee and sat down, and they ate without much conversation, which had become one of their comfortable patterns. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who had said enough the night before and didn't need to repeat it. She had gone through everything with him the previous evening. The order of testimony, what Greer expected from Harrow's lawyer, a man named Croft from Helena who had a reputation for procedural delay. The way Patterson ran his commission meetings, the specific things she needed Frank Webb to say, and in what order for maximum effect. She had laid it all out on the kitchen table, and they had gone through it together until 11 at night. And then she had said, "I think that's everything," and he had said, "I think so too," and they had both gone to bed, separately, as they had every night for the 3 months she had been at this ranch. The something different that existed between them in the evenings. The conversation that kept almost happening and then not quite. That was still there. But Silas had said one thing at a time, and she had agreed, and the hearing was today. One thing at a time. Plus, the county commission met in a building on the east end of Ash Hollow's Main Street that served multiple civic functions, meeting hall, record office, occasional courtroom, and was heated by 2 iron stoves that the building never quite got enough of. Rowan arrived with Silas at 9:30. Greer was already there, arranging papers on the table with the focused calm of a man who had prepared for this specific morning for 3 weeks. Frank and Clara Webb were there. Amos and Dora Purcell, Dora in her good coat that Rowan had never seen before. Mrs. Alderman, who had arrived early enough to secure the chair she wanted, which was on the aisle where Patterson would have to see her directly. There were others, too. People from the valley who had no formal role in the proceedings, who had simply come. Garrett from the feed supply. Miss Hale, the school teacher. 2 men Rowan recognized from the community meeting in December whose names she hadn't learned yet. Mrs. Pruitt, which surprised Rowan more than it should have. She didn't count them. She noted them. Harrow arrived at 10 minutes to 10 with his lawyer Croft and 2 men whose function was unclear, but whose posture communicated that they were there to communicate something about Victor Harrow's weight in this community. Harrow himself looked the way he always looked, composed, well-dressed, the expression calibrated to suggest he was present as a concerned participant rather than the subject of an investigation. He looked at Rowan when he came in. She looked back. Neither of them looked away first. The moment lasted about 2 seconds, and then Patterson called the room to order, and it was over, and the hearing began. Patterson was a tall, angular man in his 50s with a precise manner and the quality of attention that distinguished people who genuinely listened from people who waited for their turn to talk. He ran the proceeding without theater, laid out the scope, the petition from Greer's office requesting the expanded review, the county's authority in the matter, the order in which testimony would be heard. Croft objected to the expanded scope immediately, which everyone had expected. He argued that the commission had been convened to address a specific complaint about Boone Ranch's land grant status, and that broadening the inquiry to include prior complaint resolutions involving unrelated properties was procedurally improper. Patterson listened to this for approximately 4 minutes and then said, with the patience of a man who had expected exactly this argument, that the commission's authority extended to any pattern of conduct that bore on the integrity of the county's complaint resolution process, and that the petition demonstrated sufficient grounds to believe such a pattern existed. Croft's objection was noted and overruled. Harrow's expression did not change. Greer presented the formal record first: Rowan's employment agreement, the date of filing, the witnesses, the operational documentation she had compiled over 3 months. He walked through it methodically and without drama, building a foundation. He was good at this, she thought. Not exciting, but precise, and precision was what they needed today. Then Frank Webb spoke. She had helped Frank organize his testimony, but she had not told him how to deliver it, and she was glad of that now because what he did was simply tell the truth in his own voice without any of the structure she might have tried to impose on it. He talked about the complaint Harrow had filed against his property 4 years ago, the exact legal language used, the pressure that had followed, the settlement he'd signed because the alternative was years of proceedings he couldn't afford. He talked about what he'd lost in that settlement. Not dramatically, just specifically, the way a person talks about money that was real money. Croft cross-examined with the strategy Greer had predicted, trying to establish that the settlement had been voluntary, that Frank had made a free choice, that no improper pressure had been applied. Frank acknowledged that no one had put a gun to his head. He said that the pressure had been different from that and harder to name, but real. He said that he'd understood that if he didn't settle, the complaint process would continue until it cost him more than the settlement did. That's not coercion, Croft said. No, Frank said. I don't know what to call it, but I know what it cost me. Dora Purcell testified next. Her account was shorter and more contained, but the structural match with Frank's was exact. Same kind of complaint, same timing relative to a water rights question, same pressure, same resolution. When Croft tried the same cross-examination strategy, Dora looked at him with the expression of a woman who has run a sheep operation for 15 years and is not easily unsettled. I'm not confused about what happened to us, she said. I don't need a legal word for it to know it happened. Then Mrs. Alderman. She stood up to read from her written record, which Patterson allowed over Croft's objection that it constituted hearsay, ruling that it fell within the Commission's evidentiary standards for historical record. She read the 4 families. She read the dates and the properties and what she knew of the circumstances of each departure. She read it in a steady voice without inflection, and the room was very quiet while she did. When she finished, Croft said, Mrs. Alderman, you don't have direct knowledge of any improper conduct by Mr. Harrow in any of these cases. No, Mrs. Alderman said. I have 41 years of watching what happens to people in this valley when they have what Harrow wants. She looked at him. You're correct that I can't prove the mechanism. I can document the pattern. The room was still quiet. Patterson asked if there was anything further from the petitioners. Greer said there was one more statement, and he looked at Rowan. She had not planned to speak. That wasn't accurate. She had thought about it and decided against it and then thought about it again, and finally told Greer the night before that she would, if he thought it useful. He had said he thought it was the right note to end on. She stood up. She did not have notes. She had considered writing something and decided the written version would be worse than the spoken one, because what she wanted to say wasn't an argument. The arguments had been made. Greer had the documents. Frank and Dora had the history. Mrs. Alderman had the pattern. What Rowan had was something else. I came to Ash Hollow in November, she said. I came because someone had made me a promise that turned out to be worth nothing. I had a child, $42, and nowhere to go. Every door in this town was closed to me. She paused. Not for effect. She was actually thinking about how to say the next part correctly. Silas Boone opened a door not because he knew me, because his judgment of people was good enough to recognize that I was willing to work and that my son was cold. Another pause. In 3 months, I've kept the books, organized the operations, helped brace a barn wall before a storm, and made it through that storm without losing the ranch or anyone on it. She looked at Patterson. I'm not here to argue legal definitions with Mr. Croft. I'm here because the work I've done at Boone Ranch is real, and the arrangement is legitimate, and Victor Harrow's complaint is not about standards or community values. It's about water that belongs to a creek on land that doesn't belong to him. She sat down. Patterson looked at Croft. Does your client wish to make a statement? Croft conferred with Harrow in a low voice for a moment. Then, Mr. Harrow stands by the validity of his complaint and reserves the right to... Mr. Croft, Patterson said, with the patience wearing through slightly, Does your client wish to make a statement to this commission or not? Harrow said, no. Patterson took 2 hours to deliberate, which Greer said was fast. They waited in the cold outside the building, some of them, and inside by the stoves, others. Rowan stood in the thin February sunshine with Clara Webb and didn't talk much, which Clara seemed to understand was what was needed. Eli was at Mrs. Alderman's house with the door cat, which had become a non-negotiable part of any visit to town. Rowan thought about him there, warm, occupied, entirely unaware that this particular Tuesday morning was something other than an ordinary day. He would never know, probably. Not the specifics. When he was old enough to be told about any of it, it would be a story. The winter they fought for the ranch, the hearing in February, the man who wanted the creek water. It would be history by then, something that had already been resolved. She thought about that, about the difference between living inside a thing and looking back at it. How the same events that were almost unbearable in the forward direction became, in retrospect, simply the path you had taken to get somewhere. She didn't know yet where this particular path was taking her. She had ideas. She had the evening conversations that almost became something. And the way Silas had said one thing at a time with a gentleness that was really a promise. She had Eli saying biscuit to Pete's mare every morning with the certainty of a child who lives somewhere he expects to keep living. She had built more in 3 months than she had managed to build in the 3 years before them. That was not a small thing to know about yourself. Patterson came back at 1:30. He read the ruling with the same precise manner he'd run the hearing. No drama, no preamble, just the thing itself. Harrow's complaint against Boone Ranch was dismissed. The employment arrangement documented in the petition was found to be legitimate and in full compliance with the land grant's terms. The expanded review of prior complaint resolutions was granted, and the county commission would open formal inquiries into the 4 cases Mrs. Alderman had documented, with particular attention to whether the complaint resolution process had been used in a manner inconsistent with its intended function. Boone Ranch's water rights to the lower creek were affirmed as recorded in the original grant, and were not subject to third-party negotiation through this proceeding or any similar proceeding absent a separate and legitimate legal basis. Croft was already making notes, preparing objections, doing the things lawyers do when the ground shifts. But Rowan was watching Harrow. He sat still while Patterson read. His face was the composed face he always wore, calibrated, controlled. But something was happening around the eyes, something that the composure couldn't quite reach. Not devastation, not even surprise, exactly. More the look of a man who has been playing a game for a very long time and has just been shown that the other players have learned the rules as well as he has. He stood when it was over. He buttoned his coat. He looked around the room, which was a mistake. Not a large mistake, but one, because rooms remember being looked at that way. His gaze landed on Rowan last. She met it. She didn't arrange her expression into anything. She just looked at him the way you look at weather that has passed. He left. Croft gathered his papers and followed, and the 2 men whose function had been unclear came after him, and the door opened and let in a cold rectangle of February light, and then closed again. The room let out a collective breath that no one had organized. Was it? Mrs. Alderman found her at the edge of the room, which was filling now with the noise of people who had been quiet for a long time. "Come for supper Sunday," she said. Same tone as always, same settled certainty about things. "We will," Rowan said. The older woman looked at her for a moment with those sharp eyes that had been watching this valley for 4 decades. "You know what the difference is," she said, "between the families who make it here and the ones who don't?" Rowan waited. "The ones who make it," Mrs. Alderman said, "figure out that the land doesn't care about them. It's not for them or against them. It's just there. The ones who survive that realization and work anyway, those are the ones who stay." She patted Rowan's arm once, with the brisk affection of someone who doesn't waste gestures, and went to find her coat. Rowan stood with that for a moment. She thought it was true. She thought it was also incomplete, because the land didn't care, but the people on it did, or some of them did, and that was the part that made the difference she'd actually experienced. Silas stopping at the station, Clara coming through the snow after the storm, Frank Webb deciding not to settle again, Mrs. Alderman writing 4 families in a folded paper and waiting for someone to ask. The land was just land. The people were the reason. Silas found her by the door. The room was clearing slowly. people pulling on coats, the noise diminishing in layers. He came up beside her and stood there for a moment looking at the front of the room where Patterson was packing his own papers. "How are you doing?" he asked. It was such a simple question, she almost laughed. "I burned the toast this morning," she said. He looked at her sideways. "I know, I threw it out." "You didn't say anything." "It was toast," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and the something different that had been almost happening in the evenings was present now, in the middle of the afternoon in a room full of people putting on their coats, and neither of them looked away from it this time. "February's almost over," he said. "It is," she said. "I said one thing at a time," he said. "You did." "I think," he said carefully, with the manner of a man who is being precise about something that matters to him, "that it might be time for the next thing." She looked at him for a long moment. All of it moved through her. The platform in November, the cold, the note, the wagon, the kitchen at 5 in the morning with the coffee and the toast, the ledger, the barn, the passage in the dark, the 5 weeks of building the case that had just been decided, the evenings at the kitchen table, the almost conversations. All of it, and Eli at Mrs. Alderman's house with the door cat, saying the name of Pete's mare with complete confidence that tomorrow would contain the same things today had contained. "What's the next thing?" she said, though she already knew. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not as an employee." He paused. "I'm not good at this." "You're doing fine," she said. "I want to build something here, with you." "Not—" He paused again, and she could see him working through the words the way he worked through everything, carefully, without waste. "Not because it's practical, though it is. Because when I stopped at that station, I didn't know why exactly, and now I do." She thought about what she'd said to Mrs. Alderman in her kitchen over tea. That she'd wanted safety, stability, to stop being so close to the edge. She had wanted those things, and she had built them. Not been given them, built them, with her own hands and her own stubbornness, and the specific knowledge she'd accumulated walking through every new place she found herself, remembering what might someday matter. She had built this. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I need to. Because I want to." He nodded. Something in his face settled into itself, something that had been slightly unresolved for 3 months finding its resting place. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. It was not the most romantic exchange two people had ever had in a public building. It was the kind of agreement that people like them made, people who had been careful for a long time and had earned the right to be certain before they spoke. She did not need it decorated. It was enough. Spring came to the valley, the way spring always came to that part of Montana, reluctantly, in pieces, with several false starts that deposited a last coat of snow on ground that had already begun to soften. The creek ran high from the snowmelt, loud and cold and entirely theirs. The north barn wall was rebuilt in April, properly this time, with lumber Silas ordered from Billings and Calhoun, and Pete and 2 men from the Webb property who came to help and stayed for a meal that Rowan made large enough to accommodate the fact that she'd known they would stay. The new wall was better than the old one. That was usually how it worked with things that had been broken correctly and fixed with full attention. The county's formal inquiry into the prior complaint resolutions concluded in March. 2 of the 4 families Mrs. Alderman had documented were the Halletts in Idaho, the others in eastern Montana, and their accounts confirmed the pattern. Harrow's attorney filed objections to everything and was overruled on most of it. The commission's findings went to the state level and became someone else's proceeding, which removed it from the immediate life of Ash Hollow without resolving it cleanly, which was how most things were resolved. Not in a definitive moment, but in an accumulation of increments that eventually added up to something different. Harrow did not come back to Boone Ranch. He was still in the county. He still had land and money and people who owed him things. He was not ruined, and Rowan had never expected him to be ruined. What had changed was simpler and more durable than ruin. He had been seen clearly by enough people who mattered, and being seen clearly is something a person who operates in shadows cannot recover from easily. She thought about him sometimes, less than she expected to. She thought about what it cost a person to spend that much effort taking things that weren't theirs. Not the legal cost, the interior cost, the daily work of being that person. She didn't feel sorry for him, but she thought about it. What? The wedding was in May, which was Silas's suggestion, because May was when the valley looked the way it looked in the version of itself it was always trying to become. He said this awkwardly, because he was not a man who said things like that easily, and she had looked at him with something that she allowed to show on her face because he had earned the right to see it. It was a small ceremony. Mrs. Alderman, Frank and Clara Webb, Amos and Dora Purcell, Pete and Calhoun, Miss Hale, Garrett from the feed supply, who turned out to be a more sentimental man than his counter-presence suggested. A few others from the valley who had been part of the winter one way or another. Eli wore the wool hat she'd bought from Mrs. Pruitt's general store on the day she was supposed to be someone else's future, and he stood next to Pete through the whole proceeding with the seriousness of a child who understands that something important is happening without knowing quite what it is. After, he asked Silas if he could call him something other than Silas. Silas looked at him. "What do you want to call me?" he asked. Eli thought about it with his whole face. "Biscuit," he said finally, with complete seriousness, because that was his best word, and he was offering it. The people around them made sounds. Silas looked at Eli for a long moment, and then at Rowan, and then back at Eli. "You can call me whatever you want," Silas said, "but maybe we try a few options first." Eli accepted this as reasonable. He went back to Pete. Rowan looked at her husband. The word still new in her head, not uncomfortable, just new. And he looked back at her, and she thought about the train platform in November, and the cold, and the $42, and the note that said, "I changed my mind," and she thought about how that man's failure of character had redirected her life into this valley, this ranch, this particular May afternoon with these particular people around her. She was not grateful to Douglas Fenn. She was not going to manufacture gratitude for a man who had left her stranded in a Montana winter with a toddler. But she understood something that she hadn't understood on the platform, which was that the worst moments you survive don't define you by what they took. They define you by what you do with the space they leave. She had taken the space left by a broken promise and filled it with work and stubbornness and the specific decision made over and over to keep building even when the thing she was building had no guaranteed outcome. That was the only thing she knew how to do in the end. Keep building. Find the passages that nobody else remembers. Walk through every new place until you know it well enough that your knowledge of it might someday save someone. And when a quiet man with still hands offers you a room and a wage and no promises beyond what he can actually deliver, recognize that for what it is. That summer, Eli learned the name of every horse on the property and several that belonged to neighbors. He learned to feed them from his hand and to approach the nervous ones from the side. He learned this from Pete, who had the patient quality of someone who was genuinely happiest when he was passing on something he knew. Calhoun fixed the drainage on the east side of the barn that had caused the original rot in the first place, which meant the repair held and the north wall stayed sound through the following winter and the one after that. He did this without being asked. She noticed and didn't say anything about it, which was the appropriate response. The books stayed clean. Rowan kept them, not because she had to anymore, but because they were hers, her work, her system, the order she had imposed on a set of records that had been neglected and made them into something a person could trust. She expanded them as the operation expanded. She added 3 new supply contracts in the fall that saved money across the winter. She reorganized the spring calving records in a way that Pete used for 2 years and then modified slightly, which she took as a sign that the system was good enough to improve rather than replace. She wrote to Margaret in Spokane twice a year, regular as rain. She got letters back, long ones full of children's developments and complaints about the husband, and she sat at the kitchen table and read them, and sometimes read sections out loud to Silas because some of them were genuinely funny, and she had learned that he had a quiet, dry appreciation for genuinely funny things that surprised her every time it appeared. She did not write to Douglas Fenn. She had nothing to say to Douglas Fenn. She hoped distantly that he had found what he was looking for when he left that note on the station door, and she hoped, more specifically, that whatever it was had turned out to be less satisfying than he'd imagined. That was as much generosity as she could produce for him, and she was comfortable with the limitation. In the October of the second year, she stood at the kitchen window in the early morning, the same window she'd stood at her first week, learning the layout of the yard, memorizing exits, and looked out at the valley. The mountains were doing the thing they did in October, the particular combination of late-season light and early snow on the high elevations that made them look more present than usual, as if they'd stepped slightly closer overnight. Silas came downstairs.